Hi,
Hi,
how are you?
I'm well. How
Good.
are you? How are
Very
you?
well, thank you. Very well.
Good, good, good.
So yesterday, since we started reading that Abarbanel from his theory of government, there were a few other things I wanted to read today, again from this book.
Yeah,
Uh,
good.
okay, so our exposition of Abravanel's views regarding the lower and higher courts is based in the main, as already indicated, upon his commentary in Deuteronomy. In his commentary on Exodus, which was written in a later period, we find him advocating the establishment of political bodies whose functions seem to parallel those of the lower and higher courts, and yet differ from them in more than one respect. Therefore, before proceeding to discuss his theory on kingship, it is our intention to deal with Abravanel's views on politics as presented in his commentary on Exodus, and to see to what extent they involve a departure from his earlier position. The discussion centers on the appointment by Moses of rulers of thousands, rulers of hundreds, rulers of fifties, and rulers of tens. What were the function and the authority of these rulers? According to Exodus, their function was judicial. According to Abravanel, their function was both judicial and military. One might assume that in Abravanel's opinion, the rulers of Israel, like the praetors of Rome, were judges in peacetime and commanders in wartime, but such an assumption would be wrong. As Abravanel sees it, the rulers were legislators and statesmen entitled to declare and conduct wars rather than judges and field commanders. This concept regarding the nature of the ruler's function becomes clear from his view regarding the scope of their authority. According to the plain meaning of the text, the scope of that authority seems clearly defined. Rulers of thousands, hundreds, etc., were evidently officers whose jurisdiction was limited to a certain number of people. It would also seem clear that their powers increased with the number of people under their respective jurisdictions, and consequently, that the highest authority in the Mosaic system devolved upon the ruler of the thousand. Abravanel, however, offers an interpretation according to which the highest authority rested not with the ruler of thousands, but with the ruler of the 10. And it is within the framework of this interpretation that he advances another political system as representing the ideal government. In every large and powerful city-state, says Abravanel, there are matters which must be decided only by a body of 1,000 people specifically authorized to make such decisions. There are matters which must be settled by the consent or with the advice of 100 people, and others with the sanction of 40 or 50 people appointed for such purposes. There are still other matters which can be determined only by a group of 10 people who have the final say over all problems relating to the state. As you should know, he adds, that each and all of these governmental bodies are to be found today in the great city of Venice. They have a consiglio maggiore of more than 1,000 people. They have another council called Consiglio dei Pregati, called the Carantus, and one more council of 10 called the Consigliere dei Dieci. I have no doubt that this is the true meaning of the titles, rulers of thousands, of hundreds, and 50 and 10. It implies public officers who belong to the council of the 1,000, to the council of the 100, and so on. The numbers 1,000, 100 refer then not those to be judged, but to the judges. Even the most critical historical observer sees in the past much of what he sees in his own time. In the Middle Ages, people unhesitatingly translated the past in terms of current realities. 3 centuries earlier, Abraham ibn Ezra, for instance, had quite a different interpretation for the same chapter in Exodus. According to him, the appointment of the rulers constituted an act of punishment for the people, since it implied a change from a happy situation in which Moses alone was the people's master to a situation of enslavement by many lords. From the titles of the rulers, Ibn Ezra gathered that each of them was granted a fixed number of subjects who had no rights of their own whatsoever and were completely at the ruler's mercy. Living at a time when feudalism was still strongly entrenched and in yearning for a central authoritative rule was deeply felt, Ibn Ezra saw in the officers appointed by Moses the counts, the barons, and the knights of the Middle Ages, differing from each other in the size of their estates and the number of people subservient to them, but all equally intent on subjugating the people. Hence, he concluded, the more numerous the princes, the worse it is for the land. Abravanel was opposed to the feudal system, no less than Ibn Ezra, but his substitute for feudalism was not necessarily a government by one. Numerous princes, he maintained, are a calamity only when all of them are of equal rank, that is, where none of them is obliged to pay homage to the other. But where there is an acknowledged order in the rank of the officers, a hierarchy leading up to a supreme a supreme head, the great number of such officers, he insisted, the better the management of public affairs. Such a hierarchy, according to Abravanel, represented governmental authority, not enslavement, since the officers in public service and officials are not the people's overlords. In brief, Ibn Ezra saw in the Mosaic arrangement a prototype of the feudal system, while Abravanel, who lived in different times, saw it as a prototype of the Venetian system. The great city of Venice, the princess among the states. These expressions of praise for Venice, which appear in the Abravanel's writings repeatedly, reveal his admiration for the Venetian Republic. This admiration for the queen and the Adriatic was by no means peculiar to Abravanel. It was shared by many statesmen and political thinkers throughout this period of the Renaissance. It emanated, as we see it, not from theoretical speculations about the best forms of state constitution, but from the amazement engendered in the minds of many by Venice's position among the world powers. For centuries, Venice had played a decisive role in determining the balance of power in Europe. It dominated most of the strategic points of the Mediterranean. It controlled the sea routes to the east. Its navy ruled the waves and it enjoyed unequaled military glory. Financially, it was probably the richest state in Europe. It had amassed immeasurable fortunes, and the merchant of Venice was not only the wealthiest, but also the best protected merchant in all the world. Above all, if there was any force which checked the Turk, the most formidable and threatening foe of Christendom, it was again Venice. Constantinople, along with its great empire, had fallen prey to the Turkish conquerors, but little Venice held them at bay. What was the secret of her strength, her influence, and her wealth? What was the mystery behind the remarkable expansion of this tiny state, situated as it was on a few barren rocks in a corner of the Adriatic? The medieval mind, trained in strict logical deduction, was naturally inclined to attribute this extraordinary success to an outstanding feature in the life of the city. And what could that outstanding feature be, if not its constitution, which was unparalleled in Europe, its government without a king and without a hereditary ruler, which most closely resembled that of Rome and the ancient Greek republics. Okay, so that is that. And he's going on to that. All right, next, monarchism. The elaborate governmental system presented thus far encompasses only 2 degrees of Abravanel's human government. It does not touch on what Abravanel calls the 3rd and highest degree, the king. Nevertheless, it seems to embrace all the faculties and functions of a political society and its state pyramid built on a broad foundation. Climaxes in a head in the person of the chief of the Sanhedrin, the judge whom Abravanel invests with royal power. The evident question, therefore, is, what is the king needed for? What are the functions which he can fulfill that are not fulfilled by the other state institutions? Is there some vital element which the state still lacks and which only a king can supply? This is indeed the cardinal question which Abravanel poses at the beginning of his discussion of the subject. Is a king essential for the state, or can it exist without him? The investigators of this problem, says Abravanel, answer the questions in the affirmative. They say that the position of the king in the political order is like that of the heart to the body, or that of the king of God in the universe. They think so because they believe that kingship represented three things: unity, continuity, and absolute power. I consider this opinion about the indispensability of the king false. As to the value of unity, it is not all impossible for a people to have many leaders conducting the state and its laws in unison concurrence. As to continuity, I know of no reason why their leadership should not be temporary, changing from year to year or at other intervals, and thus making their actions subject to control and, if need be, to the punishment of those who follow them in office. As to the benefit of absolute power, I don't see any reason why their powers should not be limited, why their powers should not be limited and regulated according to established laws and customs. Common sense dictates that one man in the position of a monarch is more likely to do wrong than many people acting together. For if any of them is inclined to commit a crime, his colleagues will prevent him from doing so, knowing very well that all of them will be called to account after a short while and will be subject to the punishment meted out by their followers and to public disgrace. But, continues Abravanel, do we have to rely in this matter on theoretical arguments? We've already learned from the philosopher that experience is more authoritative than logic. We have seen many countries governed by temporary rulers and judges elected at brief intervals, acting in accordance with the limitations imposed upon them, and at the same time they control the people, conduct their wars, and enjoy real authority during the time they are in office. If it happens that one of them commits a crime, he's punished properly by those who succeed him, so that no one might dare follow by example. Have you not heard of the great power of Rome? Yes, wicked Rome, the frightening fourth beast, whose government ruled supreme and controlled the whole earth when it was ruled by her faithful consuls, but was subdued and became a tributary when it had a Caesar for its master. We have in our own days the state of Venice, the great princess amongst the nations, the glorious state of Florence, the powerful state of Genoa, as well as at Lucca, Siena, and Bologna, and many other states which have no kings but governments of temporary elected leaders. These are states whose affairs are conducted properly and justly, without complications and without opposition on the part of the people. This is why they have the wisdom, knowledge, and understanding of how to conquer foreign lands. All this clearly shows that the existence of a king is not at all essential for the people. But Abravanel's attack on kingship is not limited to this. He proceeds to the second proposition, namely to prove that the king is not only unessential, but also harmful and even dangerous. This he does by analyzing the practical side of the king's rule and by comparing his position, functions, and prerogatives with those of a judge. The three major tasks of the king are to lead his people in war, to have, as the highest officer in the state, the final say in matters of law, and to act in emergencies according with the need of the particular situation, even against the directives of the law. All these three tasks that we have seen are fulfilled also by the judge. It follows that the difference is not in the functions, but in the prerogatives. And as far as the prerogatives are concerned, the king is far superior to the judge. This superiority is expressed, according to Abravanel, in the following priorities, which are a king's by right. The king can collect taxes from the people for his own needs, as well as for the requirements of any war he may wage. No one has the right to evade the tax, while stealing from the fund is punishable by death. The property and the funds of the executed belong to the king, so does the land which he himself conquers. People are duty-bound to pay greater homage to the king than to a judge. It is forbidden for anyone to sit on his throne, to ride his horse, to use his scepter, to employ his utensils, to marry his widow. And finally, the greatest difference between the king and the judge is that the king's rule is hereditary, while the judge's is not. The throne belongs to the king and his offsprings for all time. Are these all the king's prerogatives? Does not the law grant the king outright mastery over his subjects and actual ownership of their property? Shmuel says, this is the prophet Shmuel in the book of Shmuel, This will be the law of the king who will reign over you. He will take your sons to be his horsemen and your daughters to be his cooks. He will take your fields and vineyards and olive yards, and you yourselves will become his servants. What did Shmuel mean by all this? Did he mean to say that all of this is what the king is entitled to do by law, or is it only the prediction of his behavior? In opposition to Maimonides, Abravanel decides that the king was not permitted to do any of the things mentioned by Shmuel. On the contrary, the divine law emphatically stipulated that he should not make himself superior to his brethren, nor deviate from the commandments in any manner or degree. Hence, the king has no jurisdiction over the fundamental liberties of his subjects. Not only is he prohibited from treating them as slaves, but he has no right to force them to work for him in his fields or even to prepare instruments of war for him. Furthermore, Abravanel rejects the opinion that the king is permitted to requisition the service of peasants and artisans, even for remuneration. His attitude is that peasants and artisans should be free from any service to the crown, and that Shmuel, holding this opinion, only indicated the extent of the king's injustice by predicting that he would take even peasants and artisans to do his work. And this undoubtedly without any remuneration. And then in Aristotle's Politics, Abravanel read, monarchies are royal insofar as the monarch rules according to the law over willing subjects, but they are tyrannical so long as he is despotic and rules according to his own fancy. This distinction between kings and tyrants and the very definition of kingship, rule according to the law over willing subjects, form the basis of the most prevalent medieval political conceptions. Nicholas of Cusa in the 15th century summarized the position of the Middle Ages on this question in the following brief sentence. The prince must rule according to the law and is supreme only with respect to matters which are not clearly defined by the matter of the law. Thus, the position Abravanel takes towards kingship is typical for the Middle Ages in two major aspects: in its insistence upon the supremacy of established law and its emphasis upon the limitations of the king's rights with regard to both his subjects and their property by the very dictates of that law. Okay. All right, so that is a sampling from the Abarbanel and his notion of kingship.
Now we know why he does. He disagrees with Maimonides.
Now, again, there were points where he was arguing that Maimonides himself agreed. One of the most basic was whether or not you have to have a king.
Right.
The simple reading of Maimonides, and the one that almost everybody accepts, is that he holds we have to have a king. But the Abarbanel was arguing that it didn't have to be read that way, and it's only if you want a king, then such and such. So when we look forward to a messianic age, and you have, when Mashiach comes, we speak of him as a king descendant of David. So does it have to be in a messianic time that it's actually a monarchy? And so it seems, again, from the simple reading of the Rambam, that it is, and it should be, and whereas according to Abarbanel it wouldn't. Also, there are people who argue that we are in a period of time called Ikvasa de Mashiach, which means that we're in the heels of Mashiach, that, in other words, there's a kind of slow unfolding of elements of the Messianic era that, and those elements are already shown. In other words, when the prophets were talking about what the world would look like or what Israel would look like when Mashiach comes, some of those elements have already started to emerge, and so there are those who interpret that as Ikvasa de Mashiach, that Mashiach is on the horizon, and we're starting to see a kind of unfolding of those elements which are going to be part of a messianic era. So the return of the Jews to Israel, that is considered one of the most powerful of those elements. The greening of Israel is seen as a powerful indication of those elements. There are some who point to the relative prosperity that people have nowadays as a kind of unfolding of some of the elements that would be present in a time of Mashiach. I made an argument at one point that the experience of women being considered equal to men, which is a very modern experience, is also possibly one of the indicators of an unfolding of the Messianic era, because when the Torah says, in response to eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, the Torah says, "V'hu yimshol bach," he will rule over you, and this has become that was sort of the status quo, that men had the positions of power and leadership, and women were in many ways subjects. But when it first describes a Chava, it refers to her as Ezer Kenegdo, a helpmate opposite him. It suggests that they were on some kind of equal footing, opposite each other. And so just like other elements of the curse are expected to, or curses are expected to disappear, when Mashiach comes, this, I was suggesting this would be another element. And Reb David Cohn, may he live long and in good health, from New York, who's one of the very important poskim in America, he mentioned that he also has, that he wrote about that he believes that is substantiated in Midrashim, that's the case. But anyway, so these would be elements of a kind of unfolding. So as things are unfolding and we are starting to think about what would have to change, or what institutions would have to develop in order to get back to what would be ideal bodies of leadership within the Jewish people. So if you look at that section in Devarim that he was talking about before, that some people call the Constitution of the Bnei Israel. So those elements of leadership are the prophet, the Sanhedrin, the Kohanim or the Beit HaMikdash, and the king. So you start to see people paying attention to some of these. When it comes to prophet, there is a resurgence of study of mysticism, and Aryeh Kaplan suggests that the mystical, what is called Kabbalah, was itself the teachings that the prophets received, but it went underground and is only studied by a select few. But originally, if you were somebody who wanted to become a prophet, you would study these and many other things, and as you were being mentored to become a prophet. So you see a resurgence in mysticism and the teaching of mysticism and what you would call the mystical arts during this time, and more of an attention towards that, although it's still limited, but almost an institutional, especially amongst Hasidim, it's institutionalized, the study of elements from the mystical. And then as far as the Sanhedrin, there was already a Sanhedrin formed not that long ago. It didn't go anywhere, but there was a Sanhedrin formed. It was their hope that they would eventually become an important part of how law was decided in contemporary Israel. They first formed the body of the Sanhedrin, and they informed the public about it. And then I think their hope was that the government, the Israeli government, would start to refer cases to them, and that way they could develop a kind of gravitas, because they, although they were very respected scholars, they had no followings. I mean, they had people that would, read their stuff, but they didn't have people like, let's say, a Hasidic Rebbe. The Hasidic Rebbes, let's say the Gerer Rebbe would say, I need everybody to gather on a certain day. So tens of thousands of people would gather on that day. If you had, but they didn't have those kind of people. So it didn't come with gravitas other than the names, and the reputations of some of these scholars. But they were hoping that it would develop gravitas through the gradual use by the government and maybe other batei din that would start referring cases to them. And eventually it could rise to the role of the Sanhedrin. But they set up a Sanhedrin, again, with the assumption that we're in a kind of prelude to the Messianic era. These institutions have to be established. Also,
Rabbi,
just
two things.
Yeah.
First, about Maimonides. So there would have to be established an authority. Not just a time, not just an era of Mashiach, but actually someone in a person who would be Mashiach. Or
it seems like that. It seems like every it seems like everybody, when it comes to Mashiach ben David, thinks that it's a person. Mashiach ben Yosef, there's another figure who's called Mashiach ben Yosef. He is briefly referred to in the Gemara in the tractate of Sukkah. This figure, Mashiach ben Yosef, and it's said that he is going to herald the Messianic era. In other words, his work is pre-Messianic. And in the Gemara, it says he's going to die, Mashiach ben Yosef.
Wow.
So, I mean, you already hear that when they say Mashiach ben Yosef and that he's going to die. And that's going to herald Mashiach ben David, makes you think back a 1,000 years. But if you hear people talk about it in the last few decades, there are those who suggested, maybe the last 100 years or so, there are those who suggested that it could be an era or a group of people. In other words, that could be called Mashiach ben Yosef. It could be the early Zionists, the early settlers in Israel. There were, I think, Cook suggested they could be Mashiach ben Yosef. Or there's some who suggested the victims of the Holocaust could be Mashiach ben Yosef. And therefore, for Mashiach ben Yosef, for some reason, they're more open to the idea that it could be an era or a large group of people. But again, I have not done thorough research on this. This is just from my own experience. I don't know of a major opinion that Mashiach ben David just represents an era. It for sure does represent an era. He himself, that is clear from the prophets and anybody who writes about it, that he is not the point of the Messianic era. He's going to usher it in and maybe manage it, but he's not the point of it. The point of it is a relationship with God that is much more revealed, and that all these other things that are going on are a context for God to be more revealed in the world, and that it's really about us and God, mankind and God. But it does seem like there has to be somebody. But now, so the question that's the prophecy, and then when it comes to the Beis HaMikdash, so there you also see efforts, fairly public efforts in preparation for a Beit HaMikdash, so we have the prophecy, the Sanhedrin, and the Beis Hamikdash, where you all see movement towards
Uh,
getting those
is,
going.
yeah. The
Yeah.
other thing is, have you heard anybody talking about what's going on now as Armageddon or Mag?
Well, Gog and Magog. So over the past several decades, there have been events that have occurred where they have pointed to them as Gog and Magog. When I say they, somebody will say a Kabbalist said, and then suddenly it like spreads as wildfire. So for instance, the Gulf War, because there in the Gulf War, first of all, you have the first Gulf War, you have Israel being bombed, but not as the main enemy, which is an element that you see in the discussion of Gog and Magog. In Gog and Magog, it's foreign kings who are at war, but Israel gets sort of roughed up in the middle, as in between. So anytime you have that, where you have different countries going, but Israel suffers as a byproduct, you hear people, and also Iran is technically, or Iraq is not, you don't think of it as north of Israel, but technically it's north, and you have Europe against, so basically you had the United States and Europe fighting against Iraq. And so it had those kind of elements. And so certainly if you consider Iran, and if you think of Hamas as simply a puppet of Iran, and because there is this strong theory that Israel subscribes to, that Iran, they call Iran the octopus, and it has all these tentacles. One of the tentacles is Hezbollah. One of the tentacles are the Houthis in Yemen. One of the tentacles is Hamas. And they are, and so if you want to, and this is in that language that supposedly the Israeli government subscribes to, ultimately you have to destroy the octopus. You can't just destroy the tentacles. But if you thought of Iran as the thing, and if you think of the West getting involved opposite Iran, then it would seem like you do have elements that would work well with the description of Gog and Magog. But one of the things about Gog and Magog is that it involves the nations fighting each other and Israel being damaged as a byproduct. So you'd have to, I think you'd have to think bigger than just Hamas to think about it that way.
I see.
Again, it would seem like, according to the Barbanel, even though we didn't read that part, I'm sure he does talk about it somewhere, that Mashiach could be like a prime minister or something. Even the Rambam makes it clear that Mashiach is eventually, he's a human, he's going to get married, have children, and he's eventually going to die. So, well, as a human, he's not going to live forever. So, what's going to happen after Mashiach dies? You're still going to be in the era of Mashiach, or the era that was opened up by Mashiach. So, what would that look like? So, again, according to the Abarbanel, it could be representative government. According to the Rambam, it might have to be a monarchy. So as different groups are working on these elements, which attention is being paid to them, maybe not by leadership in all aspects of Judaism, but there is attention being paid to each of these. And the real difficult one for, at least for people in what you would call the Hasidic or Yeshiva world, is what to do about this government of the state of Israel. does the government of the state of Israel have any standing in a world of Torah? And you will see that in the Hasidic world and in the yeshiva world, they do not treat the government as a realization of any kind of religious promise, and do not attribute to it any status that you would attribute regularly to a government inspired by God. This is not true in the modern Orthodox or the Zionist Orthodox world. So, and it's reflected in the prayer for the government of Israel. So, just want to see it for a second. So this is a translation into English of the beginning of it. Our Father is in heaven, protector and redeemer of Israel. Bless the state of Israel and the dawn of our deliverance. Shield it beneath the wings of your love. Spread over it your canopy of peace. Send your light and your truth to its leaders, officers, and counselors, and direct them with your good counsel. So this suggests that the present government of Israel is desired by God, is a representative of God, and gets God's special blessing. Bless the state of Israel. Yeah. Just want to see if there's. So in Hebrew, it goes, Avinu Shabashamayim Tzur Yisrael v'go alo Barech et Medina Yisrael Reshit Tzmichat Gulatenu. Which, so they, in the authors of this, it's sort of like a Mishabera. The authors of this prayer, which is said in many Orthodox synagogues around the world, phrased it as Medina Israel, the government of Israel, which is the beginning of the flourishing of our redemption. So they translated it as, and here, just Redeemer of Israel, bless the state of Israel, comma, the dawn of our deliverance. But if you look at the language, it sounds like Medina Israel, the present government of Israel, is an indication that the beginning of the Messianic era is flourishing. So they see it as having a kind of holy source and connection to God as a government of the people. First of all, in yeshivas around the world, they don't say this text. There are places that have their own text, but does not include that phrase. I know, like in Milwaukee, in Rabbi Twersky's shul, for decades, they have had a prayer that the rabbi is the one who usually says, that is a prayer for Israel and the people in Israel, but it doesn't have those words about the government of Israel. And it's very rare. I mean, even that Rabbi Twersky does that. It's not common in Hasidic circles to have that. Now, there are all sorts of shuls that are saying some kind of mishaber for the country.
And the idea. Also.
Right, and which is in that mishaber also. We have our shul does this one, and they do a separate one for the Chayalim. We actually do three. We do one for the state of Israel, separate one for the Chayalim, even though they are mentioned, the defenders of Israel are mentioned in this one. And then we have one for the return of the hostages. So, and that's very common, even in the return of the hostages one is very common, even in what you would call yeshivish places. I was in St. Louis at the Aguda in St. Louis, and they read a tefillah for the return of the hostages and the protection of the soldiers and other people. But again, the one about the government, so that is a very sore sticking point. Whether or not the present political setup in Israel is a reflection in any way of divine command, and whether something like this, or maybe a continuation of this, would be what we have in a messianic time. But it certainly does seem to be the belief of the authors of that particular tefillah, which again is very widespread.
At your shul, do you also do for the United States?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. It starts with the United States, then it goes to Israel. The one for the Chayalim is usually at the fourth aliyah of the reading of the Torah. And so that would precede all of them. And then actually, sometime during the Torah reading is also the one for the return of the hostages. So those two would precede them. But then the regular ones that happen, been happening for years, are the one for the government that we're in, and for the state of Israel. Okie dokie. We will move
Thank
on.
you. Thank
All
you.
right, be well, guys.
I'm glad you enjoyed the West Side Hanukkah story. I just got such a kick out of it.
Yeah, they did. That was well produced.
Yes.
And very, I think, thoughtfully done.
It was so joyous, I thought. Yeah.
Right.
Tonight, I guess there's class tonight?
Yeah, there is. I have to send out the thing. Yeah, thank you for reminding me.
Okay. Bye, Rabbi.
All right.
Thank you.
All happy Hanukkah. Bye-bye.
Happy